And welcome back. So we are in our early Byzantine period and we are in Italy. Now remember, at this point Italy is not the center of the empire. In fact, Emperor Justinian never even visited this church in which, these beautiful mosaics of him and his wife are located. But let's go ahead and head back inside of it. So we're inside San Vitale. We were looking at the apse and how we discussed Emperor Justinian over here as, Jesus's right-hand man. And we're going to look at Empress Theodora in a second. Now, you need to know the difference between the axially planned church, based off of a basilica, and this example of a centrally planned church. And so we're over here in the apse. So here is Emperor Justinian. And let's head on over to this side, opposite of Justinian, still near Christ, in which we see his wife, Empress Theodora, and her attendants. So consider the location of this mosaic and how much that's a testament to the emperor's respect for his wife and this elevated status, which we really haven't seen much of. And so this is found on the left wall of the apse, and it depicts Empress Theodora and her offerings to Christ within this imperial court group. So she too is surrounded by multiple figures. She is wearing this purple color, which indicates her royal status. Consider all the jewelry and the crown and the detailed ornamentation on her garments, etc. And so here we have, indicative of early Byzantine and of, pretty much the medieval era in general, is this lack of naturalism. There's this emphasis on patterns. We have modeling of the face, but we don't have any expressions whatsoever. They seem to be floating in space almost. We don't have this clear, sense of depth or, attempt at three-dimensional space. It's more about the concepts. Note that just like Justinian, her importance is emphasized by the placement of her feet. We saw that power play with Justinian, but here we have the empress at the foremost in the front. So this really, her role, she's connected to Justinian. He's victorious, he expands the empire. She's depicted as this proud empress. Consider how tall she's standing, this regal position. She was known as being extremely beautiful. You'll hear and read rumors, she was a prostitute, she was this actress. And that, like many, powerful women in history, is mostly made by, the enemies, essentially. Think of, the rumors of Cleopatra, but yet, we hear, or even against Hatshepsut, we hear about these figures, and it's, like any important person in history, their enemies will make up stories about them. Anyway, so she's, has this offering. She's part of, this holy rite that's going on. On the bottom of her garment right here, we see these three figures holding similar, offerings. And so these are supposed to represent the three magi. So you'll hear this around Christmas. Once Jesus Christ was born, shepherds came to him and the three magi came to him. So they're often in modern times depicted as kings, but magi were the head of that Zoroastrianism. I think I just mispronounced that, which is one of the oldest religions in the world in Persia. Think back to, how we studied them a few units ago very briefly. But so what's depicted here are these three leaders of that religion who came to Christ, offering these gifts of frankincense, myrrh, and gold. And so she's, associating with herself and this idea of this offering to Christ. So, the symbolism in this mosaic, it reflects this religious reverence, this interplay of power and spirituality in Byzantine art. Let's briefly head over to Hagia Sophia. You've already learned some about this. I just want to hone in on a few parts. And so we have another centrally planned church. It is now a mosque. So, originally it was a church. It has been added on over numerous years. Once the Ottoman Empire took over around the 15th century, it became a mosque. But then for I should have looked this up, but for numerous decades, it has been a museum for a long time. In fact, I was able to go there in 2012, I want to say. Anyway, when it was still a museum. But then in 2020, it was converted into a mosque. And unfortunately, many of the Christian icons, such as this one, you can see Mary in the background, have been covered up. But, story of time. The only thing constant is change. So, yeah, so let's look at the interior. Numerous domes. You don't need to know those details. I want to, show that just how intricately detailed this is. Consider how we've looked at acanthus leaf, capitals before, but look how different this is. We're marked by a different time period. And notice how the details here look so much like this Islamic art that we studied. Now, we've gone backwards in time. We studied Islamic art before the Byzantine era, but Islamic art comes about during the Byzantine era. So it's influenced by that art. So hence why these floral motifs look so familiar, is because it's of the same time period. Islamic art was looking at the beauty that was already being created around them. And so you're utilizing, aesthetically pleasing motifs. Why wouldn't you? Now, Hagia Sophia is mostly known for its dome and the use of the pendentives and this halo of light around it. And so the pendentives are these curved triangular vaultings. It's this intersection of the dome and these arches, and its structural support. And then the ribs, these part, help to distribute this weight so you can create these windows to create this halo of light, this ethereal light coming down. So before modern day electricity, consider, these 40 windows creates this halo. Notice these figures around the main dome. And so this is interesting. It's the mosaic of the seraphim. Here's another dome, or before it was covered. And so we have these same figures. So these are angelic beings, how they're described in the Bible. And for a long period of time, their faces were covered up by these gold rosettes. And only recently was one of them uncovered. It's now been recovered again. It's been converted back into a mosque, so you aren't going to see figures. But just interesting. And so here's that Mary of Theotokos that I was talking about, where you walk in, and this is one of the first ones that you see. Here's the apse over to this way. So this is one of the minor areas. And so, but here we have Mary as Theotokos. So Theotokos is her role as Mother of God. We'll see Jesus Christ in her lap. So think of even way back to ancient Greece, how we talked about the different labels for the different roles of Athena. And so we're going to see that here as well. So here's Mary as Theotokos, Mother of God, in a different format. So that wraps up our Hagia Sophia. And this is encaustic on wood. New term. So encaustic is where you're using pigments mixed with a hot wax, and they're burned into it pretty much. These have darkened over time, so they would have originally been much brighter. Notice how we have the same, medieval characteristic of these, this extreme model, or not extreme, but just the modeling of the faces, but the lack of expression. There's an emphasis on the eyes. Now, icon is the Greek word for image or painting. In medieval times, these were denoted as religious images, mostly on wood panels, for prayer, devout practice. Now they're more associated with the Orthodox Church. We'll talk about the split later. So here we have the Virgin as Theotokos with child between Saints Theodore and George, and two angels behind them. Now this is important because it's one of the very few icons that have lasted from this era. And they lasted because of where they were geographically. So we're heading over to Egypt, and look at how out in the middle of this desert pretty much we have St. Catherine's Monastery near Mount Sinai. And so we have a few periods of iconoclasm in which many, many icons were destroyed, but it didn't reach this monastery. So many of the icons that we study from this area are from this monastery. So the second commandment, you'll find this in those 3 Abrahamic religions that we've studied. It's again this idea of not making an image in which you'd be worshiping. And so we have a few examples of iconoclasm in Christianity as well, just like the many others that we've studied. In the 7th and 8th century, 726 to 787 and 815 to 843. This happens again during the Protestant Reformation. And so, many invaluable artworks were destroyed. But here's one of the few that remains from this time period. And so again, we're looking at her, when we see, baby Jesus within Mary's lap, her son, we note that that's her role as Mother of God. Now they have their halos around them, indicating their status. We see this, use of gold throughout it, which is a clear characteristic of our Byzantine era, of our medieval era. And like our, other artworks that we've studied, think of our mosaics. We have this, awkward placement of space. We do have a foreground, middle ground, background, but we're not looking at the realism of space. Mary is centrally placed, so our eyes are drawn toward her. And then notice how her eyes seem to be looking off in the distance versus the 2 saints who are looking at us. Okay, Jesus, who's looking at us, the viewer, versus the angels looking up, which we'll get to in a minute. But Mary is looking off into the distance, not focused on us, but she's looking off into the future. Because the idea is that Mary understood what, path her son was going to be going. She understood that Jesus would sacrifice himself for the greater good for others. With the Christian belief of that he sacrificed himself so that others may be forgiven and they don't have to, continue to sacrifice and draw blood for, their sins. And so the idea of Mary looking off into the distance communicates that message, is that she was aware of that. Knowing that, consider how we can look at this a little bit differently, where her face almost has this sadness to it, because it is sad. And so she's contemplating ultimately the terrible death of her son in the future. So there's that reminder for the viewer as we're looking at that, of what's to come. I want to draw your attention up to the top center and how we see this hand in which the angels, are looking at, so our attention is drawn to that. And so this, is very reminiscent. Think back to our Dura Europa synagogue and how, God was depicted by a hand. And so we're still utilizing that idea right here where the hand of God is coming down. This idea of, his presence. I should note that we are in Egypt, so we're coming back to these, look at, for example, with this one, of these portraits that were made and put onto the, mummified or bodies of the deceased, which we've already looked at, and how this style had already been utilized even under the Roman Empire to an extent, with this idea of the emphasis on the eyes and the modeling. Now think back to the late Roman Empire, against the hand of God coming down, like our Dura Europa synagogue. Oh yeah, and of course to note, which I didn't mention before, she is on a throne, indicating her status. Her feet are elevated. So consider how we've seen that since, the beginning of art. So study again their faces right here. We have this modeling across all these figures and this lack of emotion. That is not a priority during the medieval era. Now let's sidetrack for a moment and head to, study the Merovingian fibulae. And so this is cloisonne, so it's this technique of where you're building up these different segments with wire. And look at, the amount of time and detail that it took to create each of these, essentially, the fibulae are garment clasps. So consider almost like a brooch. So come back to our Justinian and our Empress Theodora, and how to, clasp this cloak together is you're going to use this fibulae. And so we're looking at an example of one of these. This is a precursor to stained glass, which we'll study in our next unit. The iconoclasm period. And then we have Charlemagne the Great. So Charlemagne the Great ruled much of Western Europe from 768 to 814. He was the king of the Franks, the later Holy Roman Emperor. He instigated, this cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. So considering this image, how he's holding this church. We've seen this before. Think back to the seated Gudea of the ancient Near East, of where, he creates all these he emphasizes and supports these building projects, and, this revival of, architecture and the arts and, education in general. And so Charlemagne is, practicing the same idea. This revival used Constantine's Christian empire as its model. So he was this, defender of Christianity. He gave money and land to the church. He protected the popes. But he was also a really good diplomat. He, controlled a vast area, but not necessarily through bloodshed. Here's this equestrian statuette of Charlemagne. I bring this up. It's on your handout to show how we're still, our late antique that we study with the late Roman Empire of our tetrarchs with these short, squat figures is still being utilized in sculpture. And so here even Charlemagne the Great is shown in the same style, where it's more about the idea than realism. So again, we're looking at the Carolingian Renaissance here. Now, I brought up that fibulae and the details of it to lead into the illuminated manuscripts. We're going to look at a couple. And so this is this formally prepared document. We're going to be looking at 2 Bibles adorned with, embellished, or the text is embellished. There's ornate details within it. And the exterior is often decorated in this, beautifully ornate, jeweled precious stones cover. We have about 700 manuscripts and fragments that survive from this Renaissance period. So, let's look at the Book of Kells. This is in Ireland. So here we have our illuminated manuscript. These images, this embellished text. And one of the most famous pages is the Cairo page. So remember Cairo, you saw that within the very first video assigned for this unit. It's this overlapping first 2 letters of Christ, the Chi and the Rho. This also contains the 3rd letter of his name. And so this page illustrates the first time Jesus appears in the Bible in Matthew 1:18. And so Christi autem generatio is the Latin for the birth of Christ. And so it is, Christianity is based on Jesus Christ. And so you're going to have this page extremely embellished. Consider the gold and this relation to the heavens that we've talked about across multiple religions. These details, this, Celtic look that we see throughout it, because this was created in Ireland. Here's some of the other details. We have this, insect-like appearance, the small little animals, squirrel-type figure, and all these extremely ornate details throughout these illuminated manuscripts. And so you'd often have, different monks working on this over a long period of time, in which you may have one, or it's believed to be, you have, for the most part, you'd have one monk, working on the text. You'd have one monk working on some of the other pattern details, another one on the animal details, etc. Here's the St. Matthew page from the Igbo Gospels, a different illuminated manuscript. Again, we have this gold, these embellished, beautiful script that we see. But I want to talk about this figure of Matthew and why he's depicted this way. So there is this argument that, well, of course, if we're looking at it, let's start with our formal analysis. We have him centrally placed. He's on the seat. His feet are elevated. And he is writing down the Gospel of Matthew, this book of the New Testament. And so we would also be analyzing the use of line, of course. The lines on his clothing, the lines on the background, the lines upon his face, and look at how we do see some emotion here, by the slanted eyebrows here. So the reason for this is this use of line is supposed to create this, idea of this frenetic energy that's going on. There is this sense of frenetic movement through the use of line. And that's because he is, frantically trying to write down his experience, write down the book of Matthew. And so, he's in this religious fervor and that's communicated through the use of line, through this formal element, as he, hunches over and is in this religious fervor as he, writes down this gospel. So if we look at the use of line, background, we're in the time period of, ancient Rome, and so we see the reference to that here. Here's another set of a different illuminated manuscript in which we see, again, St. Matthew, but consider the calm peacefulness versus this religious fervor. Okay. Let's talk about the Hiberno Saxon pursled from the Sutton Hoo ship. This is Anglo-Saxon, early medieval. It's in Great Britain. So this was actually found in pieces as part of this ship burial, The white is new, added to create, the shape. Look at the clasps on the top and this, elaborate detail. And that we saw that on these illuminated manuscript covers. So this one is interesting. Think to the idea of, you're probably familiar with the idea of like Viking burial and how they're sent off in this ship. And so this is an example of one that we found, the Sutton Hoo pursled from the 7th century from this royal burial ground in England. So it has this, it's crafted from gold, garnet, a precious stone. It was adorned with the top was leather. This white would have been leather originally. It had coins within, so it symbolizes the wealth and status of this person. So we have these, zoomorphic figures of this animal-like figure, creature. Here are some of the other details. So it's a testament to the craftsmanship of this region. And there ends this unit.